Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's interesting because usually when we pick up a book about systems for this deep dive, we're looking at something
Mm.
really tangible. We're talking about algorithms
Mhm.
or, supply chain logistics or maybe the bureaucratic red tape of a healthcare system, things you can actually point to on a flowchart.
Exactly. Concrete stuff. But today, the system we're looking at is, well, it's invisible, or at least it's designed to be. It's a system of governance that operates inside millions of private homes.
Mm.
It regulates the most intimate moments of people's lives, how they argue, how they spend their money, how they have sex. And yet, if you ask the people living inside this system, they wouldn't call it a system at all,
No, they certainly would. They'd call it nature.
or they'd call it God's will.
Right. Or tradition.
Which, if you think about it from like a pure engineering perspective, that makes it the most effective kind of system there is.
It does. Because how do you dismantle an infrastructure that people believe was built by the creator of the universe?
That is the question. And that is exactly why we are here today. We are doing a deep dive into a really significant and frankly, a pretty difficult text. It's called Marriage, Bible, Violence, Intersections and Impacts.
And it's authored by Johanna Stiebert and Saima Afzal. And I have to say, looking through the source material you sent over,
Yeah.
this is not a light beach read.
No, it really isn't. And I think we need to set the expectations right out of the gate here. Because looking at that title, Marriage, Bible, Violence, some listeners might be, tightening up.
Oh, for sure.
They might be thinking, okay, is this a sermon or is this like an atheist hit piece? So let's be very, very clear about the mission here.
Please.
This is not a theology lesson. We are not here to tell you how to pray or who to worship or to debate how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Exactly right. We're here to investigate interpretation as infrastructure. That's the key phrase. We're looking at how ancient text scrolls, written thousands of years ago in different cultures, different languages, are transformed into modern enforcement tools.
Okay, unpack that. Enforcement tools. What does that mean in practice?
It means we want to understand the mechanism, the pipeline by which institutions, whether they are churches or counseling centers or even political lobbies, can legitimize specific social hierarchies.
And in some cases, legitimize real harm.
In some cases, absolutely legitimize harm by claiming divine authority.
So it's about how you take a collection of, poetry, history, letters, and prophecy, and turn it into a rigid policy manual for a household in 2026.
That's it exactly. We're analyzing the structures, not the prescriptions.
Yeah.
We're looking at how a portable script for control gets manufactured, packaged, and delivered.
And to do that, we have to look at this really unique collaboration between the authors. Because usually, when you get a book on this topic, it's either from the ivory tower or from the glass reads. You very rarely get both in the same volume.
That stood out to me immediately, too. It's a powerful combination.
On one side, you have Johanna Stiebert. She's a professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of Leeds, so she brings the high-level academic rigor, the linguistic analysis. She's the one who can look at a verse in Deuteronomy and say, okay, the English says this, but the original Hebrew grammar and word choice actually implies that.
Which is so crucial because the entire system we're talking about relies on that phrase, the Bible says.
Right.
But if you can't read the original languages, you are entirely at the mercy of the translator or the pastor telling you what it says. Stiebert cuts right through that. She goes to source code.
And then on the other side, you have Saima Afzal. And her bio is completely different. She's a practitioner, she's an activist, an expert witness in court cases. She's the founder of a group called SAS Rights.
And she brings the perspective of a survival of a forced marriage.
A crucial point. And as we'll get into, she actually refuses to call it a marriage because there was no consent.
Right, and that's a fundamental distinction. If you're forced into a contract, it's not a marriage. It's captivity.
And Saima's work is with victims of so-called honor crimes. So you have this incredible dynamic. You have the scholar who is dealing with the ancient text.
And the activist who is dealing with the real-world fallout, the body count, essentially, of how those texts are weaponized today. It's a synthesis of theory and impact.
And honestly, that combination is what makes this deep dive so critical, because often we treat these things as separate silos, right? We have Bible study over here in the sanctuary and domestic violence shelters over there across town.
As if they have nothing to do with each other.
Exactly. But the central premise of this book, of this work, is that they are not separate. They're linked. They are deeply linked by a system of interpretation.
So let's name that system. The authors are primarily critiquing a specific modern ideology known as complementarianism. Now, I want to pause on that word.
Okay.
For those listening who might not be inside these specific circles, that term sounds incredibly academic, even geometric or something. Complementary angles.
It sounds nice. It sounds positive. We complement each other like peanut butter and jelly.
That is exactly the branding strategy. It's brilliant marketing, but you have likely felt its effects or seen them, even if you don't know the word.
So what is it?
Complementarianism is the view, heavily promoted by groups like the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. You'll hear them called the CBMW, that men and women are created with equal worth,
Okay, equal worth. That sounds good.
but distinct, non-interchangeable roles.
Okay, play the advocate for a second. Equal worth, distinct roles. On paper, that sounds
Sure.
fair, I'm the quarterback, you're the receiver. We have different roles, but we're on the same team.
Yeah.
What's the critique here? Why do the authors identify this as a system of control rather than just, a division of labor?
Because in this system, the distinct roles are not about who throws the ball and who catches it. They map specifically and rigidly to power. The man's role is defined as headship. That's their word. It means leadership, protection, provision. The woman's role is defined as submission, helping, nurturing, responding. It's an explicit hierarchy,
So it's the separate but equal doctrine, but applied to gender within the home.
essentially. And the argument the proponents make, people like John Piper or Wayne Grudem, who are cited extensively in the source material, is that this isn't their idea.
Oh, no, of course not.
They claim this is just what the Bible says. They rely on what they call the plain meaning of the text.
I'm just reading the book. Don't blame me, I'm just the messenger.
Right, I'm just the messenger. They argue that if you open the Bible and read it without a, quote, feminist agenda, this hierarchy is obvious. It's just there.
But Afzal and Stiebert, their whole book argues that this is a myth.
It is the central argument of their work. They argue that complementarianism isn't the plain reading at all. It is a modern construct. It's an ideology that is read into the scripture, not extracted out of it.
So let me make sure I have this straight. The authors are claiming that these groups are projecting a 20th or 21st century desire for a certain kind of social order, a certain kind of control onto these ancient texts, and then turning around and telling everyone, see, this is God's timeless design.
Correct. And to see that, to understand their argument, you have to look at the reality of the text itself. The Bible is a library, not a single book. It's written over centuries by dozens of authors in different contexts.
So it doesn't speak with one voice.
Not at all. It contains these beautiful examples of companionable bonds, of mutual submission, of radical equality that would have been shocking in the ancient world. But, and we have to be absolutely honest here, it also contains institutionalized violence. It contains texts about rape, slavery, and laws that explicitly treat women as the property of their fathers or husbands.
And the system works by silencing that diversity.
Exactly. It works by silencing the parts that don't fit the model. It picks and chooses verses to manufacture a single controlling narrative out of a complex and often contradictory library of texts.
That is the system failure we are talking about today. The construction of a single rigid system from a diverse source.
A system that, the authors argue, ultimately enables harm.
I want to get into the mechanics of this because you use that phrase interpretation as infrastructure. That implies this isn't just about beliefs floating in the air, it's about a pipeline.
It is.
So how do you actually build this infrastructure? Because it feels like a massive engineering project to make a 2,000-year-old text govern a modern household so strictly.
It is a massive engineering project, and it's been refined over decades. The authors, Afzal and Stiebert, they identify the pipeline pretty clearly, and it starts in the seminary.
Okay, so at the training level.
Yes. At the top of the intellectual food chain, so to speak. This is where the certified interpretation is taught to future leaders, pastors, counselors, missionaries. They're taught that faithfulness to the text means adhering to this specific hierarchical structure.
So before a pastor ever preaches a single sermon on marriage, they've been trained to believe that if they question male headship, they are sliding down a slippery slope away from God. It's not an interpretive choice, it's a test of faith.
That's a great way to put it. The interpretive choice is merged with their spiritual identity. To be a good Christian or a sound theologian is to believe that men are in charge. So then, step 2, Those pastors go to the pulpit and they preach that specific rating.
And the congregation hears it over and over and over again. Repetition.
Repetition is key. Then step 3, publishers print marriage manuals and study Bibles that codify it. They put it in writing, they add footnotes, they make it look official.
And fine.
Finally, Christian counselors enforce it in private sessions. They become the on-the-ground technicians of the system. By the time this product, this idea of biblical marriage, reaches the individual couple sitting on their couch, it has been standardized. It comes with an instruction manual.
It's like a manufacturing line.
Yeah.
You have quality control at the seminary level, making sure the product is uniform. Then you have marketing and distribution through sermons and books. And then you have customer support, or maybe tech support, in the counseling office.
That's a perfect analogy. And here's the kicker. Because it's a standardized product, if a real live marriage deviates from the specs,
For example.
say a wife is naturally a better leader than her husband, or she's the primary breadwinner, or a husband is naturally more nurturing and better at managing the home.
Normal human variation.
Exactly. Normal human variation is seen as a system error. It's treated as sin. It's a glitch that needs to be patched.
And the patch is usually, what? More submission, more prayer.
More enforcement of the hierarchy. The counseling script is almost always, you're having trouble because you aren't leaning into your God-given roles hard enough. The problem isn't the system. The problem is your failure to conform to it.
That is profound. The deviation isn't seen as diversity or personality, it's a bug. Wow. Okay, let's talk about the tools they use to maintain this.
Wow.
The source material talks a lot about proof texting. I feel like I know what that means. It's cherry picking, right?
Cherry picking is the polite way to put it. Proof texting is the practice of selecting specific verses that fit your predetermined agenda.
Your conclusion.
Your conclusion, yes. And ignoring the ones that contradict it, or the ones that provide historical or literary context that would ruin your argument. It's using the Bible like a database of quotes to support what you already believe, rather than reading it as a complex piece of literature.
It's using the Bible as a weapon rather than a resource.
I think the authors would agree with that phrasing.
They give a really specific and honestly mind-blowing example of this. It's about Genesis chapters 1 through 3, the Adam and Eve story.
The foundational text.
Right. Everyone knows the basics. Garden of Eden, apple, snake. They get naked and afraid, kicked out of paradise. But the way the biblical marriage system uses this story is, it's a fascinatingly complex piece of engineering.
This is a masterclass in reading ideology to a text. So the complementarian view, the CDMW view, argues that Adam's headship existed before the fall.
Okay, so in paradise, when everything was perfect.
Yes. They say God designed the hierarchy as the perfect state of affairs. Man leads, woman follows. That was plan A.
And their evidence for that is what?
Well, they point to things like Adam being created first, or Adam naming the animals, and they interpret those actions as signs of authority.
Okay. But looking at the text itself, and Afzal and Stiebert are very specific here, does it actually say Adam is the leader, Eve is the follower?
No, it doesn't. In fact, the authors point out something crucial. In the text, the explicit rule of the husband over the wife is mentioned for the first time after the fall. It's part of the curse.
Part of the punishment.
Exactly. Genesis 3.16. God is talking to Eve and says, "Your desire will be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." It's listed right alongside pain in childbirth and toiling in the dust for food. It's presented as a description of a broken post-fall world.
Wait. So the system takes a description of a broken, cursed world, he shall rule over you, and tries to enforce it as God's perfect pre-fall design.
That is the author's central critique of their Genesis interpretation, yes. They argue the system turns a descriptive curse into a prescriptive command. They take what the text presents as a tragedy and rebrand it as an ideal.
That's a staggering inversion.
It is. But here is where it gets really interesting and honestly a little disturbing. The authors analyze how some of these commentators, like Piper and Grudem, explain why Satan targeted Eve.
Oh, this is the Satan strategy narrative. I read this part 3 times because I just couldn't believe it was a real theological argument.
It's very real and it's very influential. So the text just says the serpent spoke to the woman. It doesn't give a reason why.
Right, it's just what happened.
But these modern commentators, they construct this elaborate backstory. They essentially write fan fiction about Satan's thought process.
Walk me through that logic. What is their claim?
The logic they present is this. Satan, being a clever strategist, knew that Adam was the head, the rational leader, the one in charge. If Satan went directly to Adam, Adam in his God-given leadership role might have resisted. He would have seen through the trick.
So Satan needed a different angle of attack.
Exactly. So according to this narrative, Satan deliberately went to the weaker vessel, the follower, to upset the chain of command. He bypassed the manager to trick the employee, hoping to cause chaos in the system.
That is wild because, again, none of that is in the text. The text doesn't mention male leadership structures or Satan's strategic military planning regarding gender roles.
Not a word of it. It's all read into the silence. But by inserting that narrative, they accomplished two very specific things.
What are they?
First, they reinforced the idea that women are naturally more deception-prone, more
Mm-hmm.
emotionally driven, and therefore need male leadership to stay safe from evil. The implication is, if Adam had been leading properly, Eve wouldn't have been vulnerable.
So it's already Adam's fault, but for not leading well enough.
Exactly. And second, and this is the really insidious part, they subtly blame Eve, and by extension all women, for the destruction of humanity because she stepped out of her role.
So, if he's the head, if he's the protector, the designated leader, why didn't he step in? Why didn't he say, hey, snake, get away from my wife? Or, honey, maybe let's not listen to the talking serpent.
That is the question the system absolutely hates. Because if Adam is the leader and he stood there silent while his wife was being tempted, he's either incompetent as a leader or he's complicit in the act.
There's no other option.
Right. But the system would much rather blame Eve's usurpation of authority than Adam's complete failure of it. It is interpretation as infrastructure. They're building a fence around women, claiming it's for their protection, but the authors argue that fence is built out of shame and blame.
And language plays a huge part in building this fence, right? We have to talk about translation. Because most of us, myself included, are reading this in English. We aren't reading ancient Hebrew or Koine Greek.
Which means we're trusting the translators.
And the authors point out that translation itself is a form of leverage. It's an act of interpretation.
Words have power, and small editorial decisions can have massive downstream effects on perception. The classic example here, which the book spends a good deal of time on, is the Hebrew word ezer.
Okay, ezer.
This is the word used to describe ease in Genesis chapter 2, when God says, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him."
Helper. Now, in English, helper sounds like an assistant, a subordinate, a junior partner, someone who hands you the wrench while you fix the sink.
Exactly. It implies subordination. That's how we hear it. But the Hebrew word ezer is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, many times. And do you know who it refers to most often?
I have a feeling you're about to tell us.
God. It refers to God. Numerous psalms and prophecies say things like, "God is my ezer. Our help comes from the Lord." The word describes God coming to the rescue of Israel in their time of need.
Wow.
Now, nobody in these theological circles would argue that God is subordinate to Israel. In that context, ezer clearly implies superior strength, necessary intervention, powerful rescue. It's more like a warrior ally than a personal assistant.
But when it comes to Eve, the biblical marriage system and the translations they prefer land on helper in the most diminutive, subordinate sense possible.
Yes. They choose the translation that fits the hierarchy they want to build. And it's not just the word choice in a vacuum, it's the entire publishing ecosystem. The authors discuss study Bibles in detail, like the very popular ESV study Bible.
I've seen these. They're huge. Half the page is the Bible text, and the bottom half is this tiny print explaining what you just read.
And that bottom half is the infrastructure. Before you even read the verse, there's a heading that tells you what the section is about. For Ephesians 5, the heading might be, "Wives, submit to your husbands."
It frames it for you.
It frames it, and then a footnote tells you how to interpret it. It effectively launches the ideology before the text is even processed by your brain. You weren't just reading the Bible. You're reading the Bible through the approved lens of the editors.
It's like having a narrator in your ear telling you what to think about the movie while you're trying to watch it. It pre-programs the reader. Don't worry about that ambiguous Hebrew word. Here is what it means for your marriage today.
And that leads us directly from the page into the home. Marriage as an enforcement site. Because all this theology, all this translation work has to land somewhere. And where it lands is on the concept of headship.
This is the doctrine that the husband is the head of the wife, like Christ is the head of the church.
Correct. And the authors argue this doctrine serves primarily to shift responsibility and legitimize control.
How so?
It normalizes coercion by reframing it as leadership. If the husband wants to move the family for a new job or make a major financial decision, or, as we'll see in some of the more extreme applications, demands sex, he can frame that not as his personal desire, but as his God-ordained responsibility. as the head.
It creates a divine buffer for what might otherwise just be selfish behavior. I'm not being a jerk. I'm being the spiritual leader.
Precisely. And the flip side of that coin is that resistance becomes sin.
That is the most dangerous part of this whole structure, it seems.
I think the authors would agree. If the structure is God-ordained, then a wife resisting her husband, even if he is being cruel, even if he's being foolish, even if he's being abusive, is framed as resisting God himself.
So leaving an abusive situation becomes a theological crisis, not just a relational one.
It's an act of rebellion against the divine order. You aren't just breaking up with a guy. You are breaking a covenant with the creator of the universe. The psychological weight of that, it's designed to be crushing. It is designed to bind the conscience and prevent escape.
The authors also bring up the famous Proverbs 31 woman. I feel like I see this referenced on social media constantly, hashtag Proverbs 31.
Oh, the excellent wife, the virtuous woman.
Yeah, but the authors call this an impossible standard. Why?
They do. In its original context, Proverbs 31 is an acrostic poem. It's an idealization, a song of praise, likely written about a woman of very high status in that society. It's a beautiful piece of poetry.
But the ideologues turn this poem into a prescription, a job description.
A checklist. A literal checklist for every single woman. They interpret it to mean a wife must be wealthy, tireless, beautiful, a savvy business owner, an early riser, a great cook, a wonderful mother, and completely submissive to her husband, all at the same time.
The authors have this amazing phrase for it. They call it a capitalist-infused religious ideology.
Which is a biting, but I think accurate, critique. It creates perpetual inadequacy. You are never enough. You are never doing enough. Your house is never clean enough. Your children are never well-behaved enough. You are never godly enough.
And crucially, even though the woman in the poem is clearly a powerful, independent figure who is running businesses and managing estates,
The system frames all that work as being solely for the benefit of her husband's reputation. Her success is only valuable insofar as it makes him look good at the city gates. Her entire existence is instrumental to his honor.
so we have the infrastructure, the translation, the footnotes, the sermons. We have the enforcement in the home, headship, and the impossible superwife standard. But now we have to go to the dark side. We have to talk about the parts of the system that try to hide the bodies, literally and metaphorically.
We need to talk about violence.
Yeah.
Violence in and around the text.
Hmm.
Because the biblical marriage narrative relies heavily on the idea that the Bible is a book of family values,
Yeah.
that it's wholesome, that it's safe.
But the authors, Afzal and Stiebert, their whole project is to say, have you actually read it? All of it.
Right. They point to texts that are, there's no other word for it. They're horrifying. And the system's response is usually to ignore them or to sanitize them, to explain them away.
Let's look at the specific examples from the source material because they are jarring. Numbers chapter 5. The ordeal of bitter water. I've heard this mentioned before, but can you walk us through what this actually is? I think we really need to see this scene.
Okay. This is a ritual law described in the Old Testament. The context is a husband who gets jealous. And the text is very clear. He doesn't have evidence. He just has a spirit of jealousy come over him. He suspects his wife of adultery.
So it's just based on his feelings.
Just his feelings, his insecurity. He then has the right to drag her to the priest at the tabernacle.
No trial, no witnesses.
No witnesses, that's the point. It's a trial by ordeal, based entirely on the man's suspicion. The priest then takes holy water in an earthenware pot. He goes and sweeps up some dust from the floor of the tabernacle.
Which, let's just imagine what that floor is like. This is where animals are being slaughtered for sacrifice. It's likely bloody, dusty, dirty.
He puts that dust in the water. He unbinds the woman's hair, which in that culture was a deeply shameful and humiliating act. He then makes the woman swear a terrifying oath.
An oath that says what?
That if she has been unfaithful, this potion she is about to drink will bring a curse upon her. The text says it will cause her womb to drop and her belly to swell. The scholarly consensus is that this means it will induce a miscarriage if she is pregnant or cause permanent sterilization and physical disfigurement.
And then he forces her to drink it.
He forces her to drink it.
And she refuses.
She can't. It's a forced ritual.
Yeah.
Her refusal would be taken as an admission of guilt.
This is abuse. It's state-sanctioned, religious-sanctioned, ritualized terror based on a husband's insecurity.
The authors highlight that this is entirely about the husband's power and his jealousy. It's not about justice. And crucially, there is no equivalent ritual for a wife who suspects her husband of adultery.
Right. Of course not. If a wife gets a spirit of jealousy, she can't drag her husband to the temple and make him drink dust water.
No. It is a one-way street of control, a tool for men to police female sexuality.
So how does the modern biblical marriage crowd deal with this? You're not going to find this passage in a Sunday school lesson. You're not going to see it in the marriage manuals.
Generally, no. They ignore it. They just pretend it isn't there.
Sure.
If pressed, they might say something like, well, that was the Old Testament law and it doesn't apply anymore, or they'll try to reframe it and say, this was actually God's way of protecting women from jealous husbands, because if she was innocent, God would protect her and nothing would happen.
Which is a wild interpretation. It's like saying a firing squad is a way to protect the innocent because God will miraculously stop the bullets.
Right. But the authors argue that this text is part of the canon.
Mm.
It reveals a worldview where women are property and men's jealousy has legal standing. You cannot claim the Bible is the unchanging word of God regarding marriage and gender, and then just pretend Numbers 5 doesn't exist.
It's the inconsistency that reveals the system. That's what I'm hearing. They pick the verse that says, wives, submit to your husbands, and they say, this is an eternal, unchanging truth for all people at all times. But then they see the verse that says, force your wife to drink dirty water if you get jealous. And they say, oh, well, that's just, ancient cultural context.
Exactly. The inconsistency is a feature, not a bug. It allows the person in power, the interpreter, to decide which rules apply and which ones can be safely ignored.
The other really difficult example they mention is from Deuteronomy, the laws regarding rape.
Yes. Specifically, the law that says if a man rapes an unbetrothed virgin in a field, he must pay her father 50 shekels of silver.
Pay the father, not the victim.
Pay the father because she is his property and her value has been diminished, and then she must become his wife.
He has to marry his victim.
He is forced to marry her, and the law adds that he can never divorce her.
Wow.
And in the logic of that time, this was framed as a sort of provision for her. Because she was now considered damaged goods, no one else would marry her, so this law ensured her social and economic survival.
But from a modern perspective, and certainly from the perspective of human rights that Afzal and Stiebert bring, this is sentencing a victim to a lifetime of imprisonment with her rapist.
A lifetime of trauma. Again, the modern biblical marriage system doesn't advocate for this legally, thankfully, but they also fail to grapple with what it means that this law is in their holy book. They sanitize it. They domesticate the horror. They try to frame it as benevolence rather than a structural failure to see the woman as a person with rights to her own body and her own life.
This leads us to the blame displacement section of the analysis, because despite all this strict hierarchy, despite all the rules, marriages still fail. Abuse still happens. Families break down. And in this system, when the hierarchy fails to produce the promised happy, godly family, who gets the blame?
The scapegoat is almost always feminism.
It's the external enemy, the boogeyman.
Always. The source material cites the book Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, which is like the founding text of the modern complementarian movement. The authors of that book explicitly blame feminism for, and I'm quoting here, sexual confusion, perversity, and even for domestic abuse.
How do they make that connection? What's the argument?
They argue that if men were just allowed to be true men, meaning unquestioned leaders in their homes and in society, then abuse wouldn't happen. They claim that abuse is a distorted, frustrated expression of masculinity that happens when women usurp men's authority.
So, let me get this straight. The argument is he hits her because she won't let him lead.
Yes, it is the classic abuser's logic writ large on a cultural and theological level. Look what you made me do. If you had just submitted, I wouldn't have had to get angry. If society hadn't confused me about my role, I would be a gentle, loving leader.
But the authors, Afzal and Stiebert, they bring the data, they bring the social science.
They do. And this is where the combination of the scholar and the activist is so powerful. They point to numerous studies that show abuse rates in conservative Christian communities are statistically similar to, and in some studies, even higher than the general population.
So the system doesn't work.
The biblical marriage system does not protect women better than the secular world. In fact, the authors argue it often creates an environment where abuse is harder to report and harder to escape.
Because of the resistance as sin concept we talked about earlier, and the pressure from the community to stay quiet.
Exactly. The system fails to protect, and then it blames the external critique feminism for pointing out the failure. It's a perfect self-sealing logic.
I want to pivot slightly to the counter-incentives, because the book isn't just a critique. It's not just a demolition project. It acknowledges there are other ways to read these texts. You mentioned interpretive communities.
This is the hopeful part of the analysis. The authors emphasize that meaning is communal. Interpretation is a team sport. If you are in a community like the one promoted by CBMW, the incentive is to find and uphold hierarchy.
But if you gather in different groups,
If you gather in groups like the Shiloh Project, which is a community of scholars looking at rape culture in the Bible, or SAS Rights, Saima Afzal's organization, you create entirely new incentives.
incentives for what?
Safety over submission, truth over hierarchy, consent over coercion. They actively look for the other voices in the text. They look for themes of consent. They highlight the verse that comes right before the famous wives submit passage,
Which is?
Ephesians 5:21, which says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. One another, mutual submission, a verse that is often conveniently ignored or explained away by the headshift crowd.
So these feminist readings act as a counter system.
A counter-infrastructure.
Yeah.
They prove that you can take the same library of text and build a completely different kind of structure, one designed for care, for mutuality, for harm reduction, rather than for control.
So we have all the pieces. I want to try to map this out for everyone listening. We promised a systems map. Let's try to visualize this web of actors and incentives.
Okay, let's draw the map verbally. Picture a web. At the very top, controlling the raw material, you have the publishers and translators.
They control the input. They're the ones deciding if Eve is a subordinate helper or a powerful warrior ally. They're deciding if the heading says wives submit or a call to mutual love.
Exactly. Then, the next node down, you have the seminaries and clergy. They are the certifiers. They take the raw material from the publishers and give the official stamp of God's will. They train the sales force.
Then the sales force, the pastors, go out to the congregations. But there's another node in there, right? The counselors.
The counselors. They are the technicians. They apply the enforcement in the private sessions. When a wife comes in crying because her husband is controlling, they are the ones who open the manual and say, the Bible says he's the head. Have you tried praying for him more and being more submissive?
And then the final big node is the congregation itself, the community.
They enforce the social norms. They're the ones who will praise the quiet, submissive wife and side-eye the outspoken, independent one. They're the ones who will shame the woman who gets a divorce, even from an abusive man.
It's a closed loop. It all reinforces itself.
And there are feedback loops that keep it running, that make it so resilient. Let's trace one. Loop one is the loop of silence.
Okay.
Abuse occurs in a home.
No.
The victim, the wife, finally gets the courage to seek counsel from her pastor. The pastor, trained in the system, prescribes more submission and more prayer, because the goal is to preserve the hierarchy in the marriage unit at all costs.
Not to protect the individual.
Not to protect the individual. The victim returns to the abuse, now with the added burden of believing it's her spiritual duty to endure it. So silence is maintained. And from the outside, the system looks stable. It looks like it's working because no one is leaving.
That's a terrifying loop. And you said there's a second one?
Loop two is the loop of radicalization. An external critique happens. Maybe it's a news article about abuse in the church. Maybe it's a feminist scholar like Johanna Stiebert publishing a book.
The system perceives a threat.
The institution feels threatened. So instead of listening, instead of self-reflecting, it doubles down. It produces more rigid books on biblical manhood. It preaches more aggressive sermons against feminism. The ideology becomes more extreme to defend itself against the perceived threat.
Wow. So why does it persist? With all these problems, why do people stay in it? What's the incentive?
The authors note a very powerful human incentive: certainty. The world is complicated and ambiguous. This system offers clear, simple answers. Hierarchy is, as they say, cheap to teach and easy to police.
What does that mean, cheap to teach?
Ambiguity is hard. Equality requires negotiation. If you're equals, you have to actually talk about who takes out the trash, who manages the finances, who makes the big decisions. In a hierarchy, you don't have to negotiate. You just look at the flow chart.
You have a penis, you decide. You have a vagina, you listen. It's brutally efficient in a very dark way.
It creates a sense of order. And for many people, that feeling of order feels like safety, even if that order is actually crushing them. The known is less scary than the unknown.
This brings us to the present day, because this isn't just happening inside the four walls of a church. We live in a society where these systems leak out into the mainstream.
They do more than leak, they flood. Think about the massive marriage advice industry. Even secular books, the ones you find at the airport bookstore, often recycle these exact tropes without crediting the source.
Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Men need respect, women need love. That is a direct lift from a common complementarian interpretation of Ephesians 5, but it's sold as pop psychology. It frames men as having fragile egos that need constant bolstering, and women as emotional creatures that need constant reassurance. It reinforces the rigid binary.
And then there's the values mask in politics.
This is where Saima Afzal's experience as an expert witness is so crucial. She talks about the constant clash between religious norms and civil law. Even if domestic violence is a crime, legally, the religious community may frame reporting that crime to the police as a betrayal of the spiritual covenant.
So you have a legal system saying you have rights as a citizen, and a spiritual system saying you have duties as a wife. And for a devout believer, the spiritual system often overrides the legal one. The fear of God is stronger than the fear of the law.
Exactly. And we see this in the public gatekeeping debates, like the Living in Love and Faith project mentioned in the book, which was about the Church of England's stance on same-sex relationships. The definition of biblical marriage is weaponized specifically to exclude same-sex couples.
It frames their exclusion not as discrimination, but as obedience to God.
It allows people to feel morally superior while actively stripping rights and dignity from other human beings. It's the ultimate, don't shoot the messenger, I'm just quoting the Bible defense.
Which brings us back full circle to the core concept of this whole show, of crisis and perception.
Yes.
Let's go meta for a second. How do we come to believe what we believe?
This deep dive shows that it is socially manufactured. We are not born believing in male headship. We are trained into it. We are taught it through repetition, through authority, through the fear of being wrong or sinful or unfaithful.
And it explains the structural resistance. The reason people get so angry, I mean, you can see it, a visceral anger. When you question something like headship, isn't just because they disagree with your translation of a Greek word.
No, it's much deeper than that.
It's because you are threatening their entire identity. You are threatening their perceived order of the universe.
If you pull on that one thread, the one that says maybe Eve wasn't a subordinate helper, the whole sweater might unravel. If that part isn't true, what else isn't true? Is my authority over my family a lie? Is my submission to my abusive husband something I've done in vain? That is a terrifying question to have to ask yourself.
And it changes the perception of violence itself. The system trains people not to see the violence in texts like Numbers 5, or more importantly, in their own homes. It relabels violence, it calls it discipline, it calls it passion, it calls it jealousy, it calls it leadership.
It changes the prescription of the lens you're looking through.
Yeah.
You look at control, and you're taught to see love. You look at silence, and you're taught to see peace.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Marriage, Bible, Violence by Afzal and Stiebert, what is the final synthesis here? What does this book help us see differently?
I think at its core, the book forces us to confront that authority, especially authority that claims to be divine, is often a human construct used to protect power.
And that we need to look at these texts differently.
Yes. We need to stop looking at these texts just as relationship advice or as simple devotional material and start seeing them as documents of governance. They're being used right now to govern bodies, to govern finances, to govern lives.
And that question of governance leads to a choice.
It does. I think the final provocative thought the authors leave us with is a choice between ethics and blind obedience. If a system requires the silencing of victims to maintain its truth, is that truth actually true? Or is it just power dressed up in holy vestments?
That is the question. And it's one that every listener, regardless of their background, has to answer for themselves.
Indeed.
That brings us to the end of this deep dive. Saima Afzal and Johanna Stiebert's book is Marriage, Bible, Violence, Intersections and Impacts. It is a tough read, but an essential one if you want to understand the machinery behind so many of our current culture wars.
Highly recommended. Find it at your library or local bookstore.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.